This is going to be the practical part of making bread. As I've talked about elsewhere in a health-related lecture, I only make one type of bread, that is einkorn sprouted sourdough bread. Einkorn wheat is the original wheat, unmodified by humans. It grew wild and was subsequently domesticated about 10,000 years ago. Sprouting is a method of processing the grain in which it is allowed to grow. It's hydrated, and then that growth is stopped. It's dried and then ground into a flour. That has various beneficial health effects that I've talked about in other videos. And sourdough, likewise, is the original way of making leavened bread. So modern bread using baker's yeast is actually a very modern process. Prior to that, all bread was sourdough. That was just the nature of leavened bread. So we're going to go back in time to make some of the most ancient possible bread using einkorn wheat that has been sprouted before it was ground and using a sourdough process. A few notes that are going to be important if you're following along. Number one, we are working with living organisms. So sourdough uses bacteria and wild yeast, and things that kill bacteria and yeast are not going to be good for it. So I cleaned my work surface with boiling water only. Anything that is antibacterial, like antibacterial soap, chemicals, bleach, chlorinated water. So I don't use water out of the tap. I use a specific spring water. All of those things are going to kill off our friends that are doing the work for us. Similarly, don't wash your hands with antibacterial soap while you're doing this. Wash with a regular soap or just water while you're in the process of it. Also, I said spring water. Dasani and similar products are actually not spring water. It should say spring water on the bottle. Dasani is actually just New Jersey municipal water, just bottled out of the source. You also cannot use distilled water. Distilled water actually is leached of all the minerals, and those minerals are needed by the bacteria to replicate and survive. Ideally, something that says spring water on it, bottled at the source, is ideal. So let's get started. I have pre-measured 533 grams of sprouted einkorn flour. Jovial Foods makes some. This is actually made by a company called To Your Health Sprouted Flour Company that's based out of Alabama. Shout out to them. They've been my main supplier, though Jovial also does a great job. I have also measured out 400 grams of spring water. About 5 hours ago, I fed this starter and got it started. No pun intended. It is now ready to go. As you can see, it's very bubbly, very active. And I'm going to now measure out 11 grams of salt. So in baking, we typically refer to things in what's called baker's percentages. Baker's percentage is simply using the weight of the flour as 100%, and then everything that's less than that is reflected as a measure of that. 400 grams of water is 76% of 533 grams of flour. So this is a 76% hydration dough. Similarly, the salt, 11 grams, is about 2%. And we're going to be using 49 grams of starter, which is about, I think it's about an 8% inoculum, if I remember. Can't do that math off the top of my head. So I'm going to take the salt, mix that in. I like to mix dry ingredients first. And there are a lot of ways of going about building. If you look online, you'll find hundreds, if not thousands, of people making bread dough. One of the things we're focused on here is the challenge of making a bread dough out of einkorn. Being the most ancient grain, has not been modified by human beings for our convenience. Part of modern wheat is making dough easier to build, easier to work with, and the gluten's stronger and more extensible. We won't have any of those advantages, and so a lot of what we have to do is to build the strength of the gluten in a way that would actually make a modern bread rather tough and unpalatable. So we're going to be doing a lot of different maneuvers in order to affect the dough, to build the gluten, and make it as strong as possible. That said, it'll never be quite as strong as a modern gluten. Einkorn bread inevitably turns out fairly dense. It's not going to be a light, fluffy ciabatta loaf. Even at a high hydration, I've gone up as high as 90% hydration. It doesn't get any lighter. Though, by the way, I'm a doctor, not a baker by trade. So if anybody has tips on how to get a lighter, fluffier loaf, I'm all ears. Out of 100%, by the way, einkorn flour. The other important tip is that einkorn takes up moisture extremely slowly. And so we can't just dump the water in and expect it to go well. You end up with kind of a soup. So basically, I mimic my pasta making technique in terms of building the gluten. Actually, not even pasta making. For wheat, I actually use a technique that I found from a Japanese soba noodle master using 100% buckwheat flour. And that was super interesting because buckwheat does not contain any gluten at all. And it is therefore similarly rather hard to work with. This noodle master had a method of using of working the flour into a dough that would generate as much tension as possible despite having no gluten. We're going to do a similar thing here. Even though we have a gluten, it's a very weak gluten. So that is 49 grams of starter. Here, you notice me wet my finger. Wet dough won't stick to a wet finger. Dry dough won't stick to dry fingers. So when you are working with the dough as it gets wetter and wetter, you'll see me wet my hands periodically. Right now, if I stick this wet finger in, all the dough will adhere to it. So I'm going to keep that a little bit out. But this sourdough starter, because it's coated in flour, isn't sticking to my floured hands. As I pull it apart, this exposed portion can get sticky. Einkorn wheat is a very, very sticky dough, which is ironic since the gluten isn't very strong. You would think that it would be less sticky. In my experience, at least, it requires a bit of patience and skill to work with. Patience being key. We're going to do things overall a lot slower than you may see in other bread making videos, specifically because this wheat requires a little bit of extra care. So, mixing the starter. I like to break up the starter so that it's distributed and not all stuck in one place. Ultimately, as we mix, hopefully that'll become more and more uniform. And I'm going to start adding water relatively slowly. I'll add a bit, and then I'm going to mix it in. And as you can see, it starts clumping a bit. And that is actually what I want. Each of those clumps is going to be a low hydration clump of flour and water. And water plus the flour is what allows gluten to develop. Gluten starts developing the moment it comes in contact with water, but actually grows better in a lower hydration environment. It needs water, but with only a little bit of water, the proteins are relatively close together and have an easier time stringing themselves together into those long gluten strands. So in each one of these, the gluten is starting to activate, starting to bind, and becoming gradually stronger as it interacts with other gliadin and glutenin molecules. Allowing that to proceed in a relatively low hydration environment is going to allow that gluten to strengthen up as much as it possibly can. So that's why I start just a little bit of water at a time. This technique, the French called bassinage, which is just adding a little bit of water at a time. The French, I guess, required a term for that. And this, again, allows the gluten to form and become stronger. You're going to see me do a variety of techniques, which I'll talk through. But keep in mind that if you're not using this flour, these techniques can actually result in a dough that's the gluten that's overly strong with a modern wheat. and actually may end up making a relatively tough bread. Another thing I love and I really enjoyed about bread making is becoming aware of the ambient environment. In summertime, the flour takes up water more readily, the fermentation happens faster, everything's a little bit quicker. In winter, it's all a bit slower. In fact, this morning it was quite a bit cooler in the house than it is now. And the loaf I was putting together at that time really had a hard time coming together. It was happening a lot slower than this. I really had to work with the dough and be very, very patient with it in order to get it to start coming together. So you can see me here, I'm breaking up the dough, tossing it, allowing these, see, you can see all this spare flour. I'm trying to let all of that spare flour come into contact with some water so that every bit of flour has some contact with water while not yet quite all coming together into a single dough just yet. Again, breaking up each of these bigger pieces. As I break it up, I expose the wet inner side, and that allows for more flour to bind to the hydrated pieces. Just going to keep adding. Now, at this point, if I were making pasta, it would actually be adequate to start bringing it together. It looks very, very dry. But if you start pushing it together, in the time that it takes to push it together, it will actually hydrate and would be able to make a dough that could be kneaded. But that would be a relatively thick, firm dough and would not be ideal for bread making. It's too low of a hydration, and although it will hold air quite well, it will not be flexible enough to rise the way we want it to. So we're going to keep adding water. And now the dough is going to start getting stickier and stickier. I am retaining, as you can see, a bit of water here, and even when I finish and I start bringing this dough together completely, I'm going to have some water left over. Part of that's to work with, and part of that is just because this bassonage works better as fermentation proceeds. So as it starts fermenting, as the sourdough starter starts working, it actually allows for better water absorption. So now you can see it starting to come together. So now it's becoming a single lump, and I'm allowing that to happen, promoting that. As I push down, this sticky surface is kind of being revealed, so I can flip that over and start absorbing the dry stuff on the other side. This also gets easier if you turn it out on the countertop, but then you have to clean your countertop. We'll do that here in a second, but we'll do that mostly just to work the dough. Despite the somewhat more annoying process here, I just find it easier and less cleanup to kind of have a one bowl method here. My preference, if you really just hate working with dough this way, it will be faster if you just turn it out and then just scoop the flour on top of it. I'm going to add just a little bit more water here. Won't take much. There we go. Now, I will tell you, I think that one of the hardest parts of bread making for me was learning to tolerate having sticky fingers. I absolutely hate sticky fingers. I have since I was a kid. And this is a deep personal challenge that I've accomplished here. But it is to be expected as a part of this. Now, you can see that this has kind of come together. It is a single lump. There are some bits on the bottom that I can scrape off and tap back on. There is a little bit of lossiness to this process. You're going to lose a little bit of flour, you're going to lose a little bit of water, and it all kind of works out in the end. I am going to weigh the final dough. You'll see me do that just to make sure that we haven't lost too much. And of course, I'm going to scrape off my fingers here. This, as you can see, is not very easy to work with. It's a very stiff dough, very sticky. And so with einkorn, because it absorbs water slowly, often your best bet is just to wait and let it finish. So we're going to wait 15 minutes. We're going to come back and we'll give this another set of turns. We're going to do some lamination and keep building this gluten strength. I'm going to straighten my fingers off here and we'll be back in 15 minutes.